Let's get started. Story number 1.
The old farmhouse sat at the edge of town, just far enough to feel isolated, but not so far that it couldn't be seen from the main road. Sarah had always been drawn to old houses, to their creaky floors and hidden corners, so when the opportunity arose to stay in one for a few weeks while she worked remotely, she didn't hesitate. The house had been on the market for years, but no one had ever bought it, and the owner had decided to rent it out instead. Sarah drove up the long gravel driveway on a chilly fall afternoon, the orange and yellow leaves swirling around her car. The farmhouse looked even older than she had imagined. Its windows were dark, its wooden siding weathered by time, and the porch sagged just slightly on one side. Still, there was something about it that felt comforting in its quiet, weathered state. The first night was uneventful. She unpacked her things, made herself a cup of tea, and settled into the cozy living room. The house was cold, but Sarah didn't mind. She liked the stillness of it, the way the air felt thick with history. She ate dinner in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackle of the logs, and eventually went to bed, pulling the heavy quilt up around her shoulders as the wind howled outside. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of something tapping softly against the window. It was a light, rhythmic sound, like raindrops falling on the glass. She rubbed her eyes and glanced out the window. There was no rain, but the trees outside swayed gently in the breeze. She chalked it up to the wind and went about her day. Over the next few days, however, the tapping continued. It was always the same, faint and consistent, like someone trying to get her attention. She checked the window every time, but never saw anything unusual. The feeling of being watched began to creep up on her, but she dismissed it. It was an old house, after all, and old houses creaked and groaned with the wind. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to feel truly unsettling. Sarah had just finished working and was preparing to go to bed when she heard a loud crash from upstairs. It sounded like something had fallen, something heavy. Her heart raced as she stood frozen for a moment. She called out, but there was no answer. After a few minutes of silence, she cautiously ascended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. At the top of the stairs, she found nothing. No broken objects, no sign of what had made the noise. The hallway was dark and still, the only light coming from the small lamp at the far end of the corridor. She stood there for a while, trying to convince herself it had just been her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the tapping again. It was louder now, almost as if it were coming from inside the room. Sarah sat up, heart racing, and stared into the darkness. She couldn't see anything, but the sound persisted, faint but steady. It wasn't coming from the window. The tapping stopped abruptly. There was a long silence, and then just as Sarah was about to lie back down, a soft, strained voice whispered her name. Sarah. The voice was thin, barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. Her blood ran cold. She knew no one else was in the house. No one had been there all day. She was completely alone. She pulled the covers tighter around herself and sat up, her mind racing. The voice had sounded so real, so close. There was no logical explanation for it, no way to explain what she had heard. She lay back down, but the unsettling feeling lingered. The following morning, she decided to investigate. There had to be some explanation for the strange occurrences. Perhaps the house was just old and creaky, and she was imagining things. She went up to the attic, which she hadn't yet explored. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder as she made her way up. The attic was full of old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten memories. She spent a few minutes sifting through the boxes, but there was nothing unusual. It was quiet, eerily so. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor near the corner of the attic. It was a small, tarnished locket, half buried beneath a pile of old blankets. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The locket was delicate, with intricate designs engraved on the front. When she opened it, she saw a small photograph inside. The picture was faded, but it showed a woman who looked oddly familiar. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The woman in the photograph had the same eyes, the same smile as the figure from the dreams she'd been having. The dreams were always the same. She was walking through the house, searching for something, and at the end of each dream, she would see the woman standing in the doorway, watching her. She stared at the photograph for a long time, her breath shallow. Something about it made her feel uneasy, like she was on the edge of remembering something important, swift about something she wasn't meant to. That night, as she sat on the couch trying to shake off the strange feeling, she heard the voice again. Sarah. This time it was louder, clearer, coming from the doorway. She stood up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed to the door and threw it open, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had to leave. She couldn't stay in a house that was haunted, that was playing tricks on her. But as she started to gather her things, she heard the voice one final time. Not from the hallway, but from inside her own room. Don't go. It was a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with fear. She felt the cold air around her shift, and then out of the corner of her eye, she saw the shadow of a figure standing in the doorway. It was the woman from the photograph. The same woman who had haunted her dreams. The figure stepped forward, her face coming into view. Her eyes were sad, tired, as though she had been waiting for a long time. Sarah wanted to scream, but no sound came. The woman's lips moved again, though her words were barely a murmur. You belong here. The cold in the room intensified, and Sarah's head spun. She had to leave. She had to get out of there. But her legs wouldn't move. It felt as though the house was holding her in place, as though it was pulling her into its depths. With all the strength she could muster, Sarah bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out of the front door. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. As she sped away from the farmhouse, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was dark, but she could have sworn she saw the woman standing in the window, watching her go. Sarah never returned to the farmhouse. The place was eventually sold, and the new owners reported strange occurrences of their own. The house remained as it always had, a silent witness to its past, waiting for the next person to uncover its secrets. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It had been weeks since Sarah moved into the small house on the outskirts of town. A cozy 2-bedroom place, nestled among trees, it was far from the city and offered a kind of peace that she hadn't experienced in years. She had always dreamed of owning her own home, and when the opportunity came up, she jumped at the chance. The price was too good to pass up. The house itself was a bit older than she had expected, with creaky floors and drafty windows. But it had charm. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. At night, the wind would howl through the cracks in the walls, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. But Sarah wasn't one to get spooked easily. She'd been through enough in her life to know that the world didn't work in supernatural ways, or so she thought. One night, after an exhausting day of unpacking, Sarah decided to settle in early. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, trying to relax. The house was still, but a strange feeling crept over her, as if she wasn't quite alone. She dismissed it, blaming it on her imagination. But then from upstairs came a soft thud. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was distinct. A muffled sound, like something had dropped. Sarah set her glass down, listening intently. The house was old, and it settled at night. She knew that. The creaks and groans were part of the charm, she had told herself. But the thud was different. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Another thud. Louder this time. She stood up, hesitating for a moment. The house was silent again, just the wind outside and the distant rustle of the trees. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen and made her way upstairs. The air felt colder than it should have been, and the floorboards creaked under her feet as she walked down the hallway. The door to the spare room was ajar, and as she approached it, the feeling of unease intensified. The room was dark, but the faintest outline of furniture could be seen in the gloom. The bed, the dresser, the old rocking chair in the corner, everything seemed in place, but the air in the room was thick with something unexplainable. And then, in the darkness, she heard it. A soft voice. Sarah? Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a whisper, but it was just loud enough to make her heart skip a beat. The voice sounded distant, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within the house, or perhaps from the walls themselves. Sarah, the voice repeated, more insistent now. She took a step back, her hand shaking as she reached for the door frame. The voice was unmistakable, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't her name being called in a normal way, but more like an echo, a distorted version of it. "Who's there?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. There was no answer, but the air seemed to grow colder. She looked around the room, scanning the corners, the shadows. Nothing. Just the house settling, she muttered to herself, turning away. She had to be imagining things. She had been working too hard. Stress was getting to her. The strange sound, the voice, it was all in her head. She made her way back to the stairs and descended, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. The next night, after another long day of work, Sarah decided to go to bed early. The unsettling feeling from the night before still lingered, but she brushed it aside. She lay in bed, pulling the covers up tightly, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the voice, the way it had echoed through the house, as if it were coming from somewhere just beyond her reach. Then the thud came again. This time it was much louder, like something had fallen off a shelf or a piece of furniture had been knocked over. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. She had to investigate. She grabbed her flashlight from the nightstand and crept down the hallway, trying to ignore the chills that ran up her spine. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. At the foot of the staircase stood a figure. A tall, thin figure, draped in shadow. It was motionless, like a statue. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The flashlight's beam trembled as she tried to focus it on the figure, but it wasn't just the darkness that made it hard to see. It was as if the figure was absorbing the light, shifting within it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she took a step back, ready to retreat, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move slowly, its head tilting ever so slightly as if studying her. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, distorting its form in a way that made it impossible to focus on. Sarah's hand shook as she pointed the flashlight directly at the figure. And then, in the light, she saw it. Its eyes, empty, dark, hollow. A cold wave of terror washed over her. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a clatter. The figure was now standing directly in front of her, its presence overwhelming. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken threat. Without thinking, she turned and ran. She dashed down the stairs, into the living room, and bolted toward the front door. But when she reached for the knob, she froze. It wouldn't turn. She yanked on the door with all her strength, but it stayed firmly locked. Panic rose in her chest as she stumbled backward. The house seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the temperature dropped suddenly, the cold seeping into her bones. The figure was behind her. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, this time much closer, its tone low and guttural. She turned slowly, her breath ragged, and found herself face to face with the figure once more. It was no longer a shadow, but something more solid, its features now visible. A woman, or at least what used to be a woman. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow and lifeless. Her lips moved, but no sound came from them. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. "No. No, please," she whispered, backing away. The woman reached out, her fingers long and skeletal, and Sarah screamed. The lights flickered. The house groaned. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. Everything fell silent. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, shaking, her heart racing in her chest. The door was now open, as if it had never been locked. She didn't hesitate. She bolted from the house, running into the cold night air, not stopping until she reached the main road. She never went back to that house. She didn't have to. She had already felt its cold grip on her, a presence that would follow her for the rest of her life. The house was abandoned soon after, left to decay in silence. But Sarah knew better than to think it was truly gone. Some things never left. And the house, with all its secrets, had a way of calling those it chose to claim. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to ghosts. I never believed in spirits or anything supernatural, chalking up strange noises or unexplained occurrences to my overactive imagination or the house settling. But that was before I moved into the old house on Maple Street. It was an antique house, one of those places with high ceilings, creaky floors, and faded wallpaper that made it feel stuck in time. It had been on the market for months, and when I finally walked through it, I could feel something odd in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. But I wasn't about to pass up a good deal, especially in a town as quiet and picturesque as this one. The house was perfect for me, or so I thought. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the solitude. I liked the isolation. It was peaceful. But after a week or so, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. At night, when the house was silent, I would hear faint footsteps upstairs. It was always around midnight, and they sounded like they were walking slowly, deliberately, just one step at a time. I would lie in bed, trying to convince myself it was the house settling, but each time I heard it, I felt a little more uneasy. It wasn't just the footsteps, though. There were other sounds, too. Soft whispers, barely audible, drifting through the hallways. The kind of whispers you might hear when someone is talking just outside your door, but when I checked, there was no one there. I began to wonder if I was just imagining things. Maybe the silence of the house was playing tricks on me. One evening, I was sitting on the couch in the living room, reading a book, when I noticed something strange. A cold draft swept through the room, despite all the windows being shut. I looked up, instinctively glancing toward the hallway. It was dark, but I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows, like a figure standing just out of view. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the chill in the air seemed to settle around me, and I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The next night, I woke up to a soft sound, like the rustling of fabric. At first, I thought it was my cat, but when I turned on the light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the corner of my room was a figure, a tall, thin shape, draped in what looked like an old, tattered cloak. The figure was motionless, facing the wall. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But when I opened my eyes again, it was still there. My heart pounded in my chest, and before I could even think, I jumped out of bed and ran to the door. I slammed it shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The figure didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting up in my bed, every muscle tense, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I went to the corner of the room where the figure had stood, half expecting to find something that would explain it, a coat hanging from the back of a chair, or maybe a shadow from the tree outside. But there was nothing, just an empty corner and a deep sense of unease that seemed to linger in the air. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was losing my mind. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences kept happening. I started hearing the whispers more clearly, low, muffled voices, almost like a conversation, but I couldn't make out the words. The footsteps became more frequent, and I would catch glimpses of something moving in the corners of my vision. The house had become a place I didn't want to be. One night, I decided I had had enough. I wasn't going to let whatever was haunting me take over my life. I needed answers. I began researching the history of the house, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange happenings. What I found was more unsettling than anything I could have imagined. The house had been built in the late 1800s, and it had once belonged to a family who had mysteriously disappeared over a century ago. No one knew exactly what had happened to them, but rumors swirled that the house had been cursed, that the spirits of the family lingered within its walls. Some said they had been murdered. Others claimed they had vanished without a trace. Either way, the house had always been associated with strange occurrences, and after the family disappeared, it had remained empty for decades. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the stories. I had unknowingly moved into a house with a dark past, a house that seemed to have a life of its own, one that was filled with memories of those who had lived and died within it. The next night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I stood in the middle of the living room, heart racing, and spoke aloud to the empty house. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what happened to you, but you have to leave me alone. This is my home now." For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, but then the temperature in the room dropped, and I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Leave," I froze, unable to move. The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper, it was as though someone was standing right next to me, speaking directly into my ear. Leave, the voice repeated, and this time I felt a hand, cold and clammy, brush against my shoulder. I ran. I didn't care what happened to the house. I didn't care about the history or the mystery. I grabbed my things and left, not even bothering to pack everything. The only thing I cared about was getting away from whatever had been in that house. I stayed with a friend for a while, and when I finally returned to the town, the house was no longer mine. I'd sold it at a loss, and the new owners, well, I never heard from them again. Some people in the town say the house is still haunted, that the family's spirits never left. I don't know if that's true, but I know what I experienced. I haven't set foot near Maple Street since that night, and I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The small cottage at the edge of town had always been a place of whispered rumors, but it was also the perfect retreat for Amy. A writer by profession, she had been looking for a place to clear her mind and finish her book. When she found the cottage listed for rent, tucked away in the woods, she knew it was exactly what she needed. The price was reasonable, the view was serene, and the isolation felt like the perfect escape. The first few days in the cottage were peaceful as Amy settled into her routine. The house was quaint, with faded wallpaper and old wooden beams. It was clear that it hadn't been renovated in years, but it had a certain charm. The kitchen was small but functional, and the living room, with its cozy fireplace, quickly became her favorite spot to write. At night, however, a strange unease crept in. Amy couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the cottage felt off. It wasn't that it was particularly eerie or unsettling at first glance. It was just the quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. The first incident happened on her third night. She was sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen, trying to push through the writer's block that had been hanging over her for days. The clock on the wall ticked away steadily, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Then, out of nowhere, she heard a soft thud from the hallway, followed by a faint creaking sound, as though someone had just walked across the wooden floor. Amy froze, staring at the doorway that led to the hall. Her heart raced. She'd been alone in the cottage for days, and there was no one else here. She waited, holding her breath, straining to hear more. The house was old, and the floorboards often creaked. Maybe it was just the house settling, she told herself. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway toward the room where she was sitting. Amy stood up so quickly her chair scraped harshly against the floor. Her pulse was pounding in her ears as she moved toward the door, cautiously peeking into the dimly lit hallway. The house was empty. The house was empty. The floorboards were still and was out of place. She felt foolish. Of course, it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or the house shifting in the cold night air. But even as she reassured herself, a sense of dread lingered in her chest, refusing to let go. The next day, as the sun set and night crept in again, Amy tried to push aside the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down to write, determined to focus on her work. The evening passed without incident, but when she went to bed that night, she felt a strange unease. She had just drifted off to sleep when a faint sound pulled her back from the edge of slumber. A soft whisper, as if someone was standing right next to her, murmuring words she couldn't quite understand. She jerked awake, sitting up in bed, her breath coming in quick gasps. Her heart was racing, her room was still, and there was no one there. She turned on the bedside lamp, trying to shake off the feeling. The whispering had stopped, but now there was a heavy stillness in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. Amy lay back down, determined not to let her imagination get the best of her. But as she closed her eyes, she couldn't help but feel the weight of eyes on her, watching from the corners of the room. The next morning, Amy woke with a lingering sense of dread. She couldn't explain it, but the events of the night before seemed too vivid to be ignored. She went through her day, trying to distract herself with writing and exploring the small town nearby. But by evening, the sensation returned. It was as though something had shifted in the house. It was no longer just a sense of being watched, but of being followed. That night, she went to bed early, exhausted from the strain of trying to ignore her anxiety. As she lay in bed, she heard the creaking again, faint but persistent. This time the sound seemed to move. It started at the foot of the stairs and crept toward the door of her bedroom, stopping just outside. Amy's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, just as they had been on the first night. Then, without warning, the door handle began to turn. Amy bolted upright, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. Her room was completely dark except for the faint moonlight spilling in from the window. She reached for the door, her fingers hovering just above the handle, ready to lock it when the handle stopped moving. For a long moment, the house was still. There was no sound, no movement, only silence. Then there was a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A gentle rap, as though someone was asking for permission to enter. Amy's breath caught in her throat. She had been alone in the cottage for days. She hadn't invited anyone over, and there was no one who could have gotten inside. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Hello?" Amy whispered, her voice barely audible. She stood, paralyzed, staring at the door, too frightened to move. Her instincts told her to flee, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The knock came a third time, this time with a force that rattled the door. The sound echoed through the house, deep and hollow. Amy took a shaky step toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She hesitated, then flung it open. The hallway was empty. The lights flickered above her, casting long, twisting shadows along the walls. There was no one, nothing out of place. But as she stepped into the hallway, she noticed something strange. The floorboards in the hallway just outside her room were disturbed, as though someone had been walking there recently. Dust had been pushed aside, leaving deep imprints where footsteps had been. She backed away, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Her pulse was racing, her head spinning. There was no logical explanation for what she was experiencing, but the sensation of being watched, of being followed, was undeniable. That night, she packed her bags and left the cottage, leaving behind her work and her dreams of finishing the book. She drove back into town, unable to shake the feeling that something in that house was waiting for her, something old, something persistent. The next day, she returned to the cottage, bringing a friend to help her retrieve her things. They entered the house cautiously, but there was no sign of any disturbance. The air felt lighter, less oppressive. Amy couldn't explain it, but the feeling of dread had disappeared. As they packed her belongings, Amy took one last look around the house. There, in the corner of the living room, was a small photograph, one she hadn't noticed before. It was an old, faded photo of a woman standing in front of the very cottage, smiling. Amy didn't recognize the woman, but there was something unsettling about her presence in the photograph. She turned to her friend. "Who do you think this is?" Her friend glanced at the photo and then back at Amy. "I don't know, but maybe she used to live here." Amy nodded, her mind racing with questions. She didn't know who the woman was, but something told her that the cottage's strange happenings weren't just a figment of her imagination. As she left the cottage for the last time, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. The house, with its creaking floorboards and whispering hallways, still held its secrets. And somewhere in the shadows, something waited. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I'd always been a logical person. I believed in the science of things, in explanations that made sense. Ghost stories and paranormal tales were just that. Stories. That was until I moved into the old Victorian house on Oak Street. I found it online, an affordable place in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for a fresh start after a tough breakup. It wasn't much, just a 2-story home with faded blue siding and overgrown ivy creeping up the walls. Still, it felt like home as soon as I stepped inside. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the air had that musty, antique smell, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was old, but full of character. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, cleaned, and settled into a routine. There was one thing, though, that felt off. The house was always quiet, a silence that sat heavy in the air. But I told myself it was just an old house, settling in the cold winter nights. But then, late one night, I heard something. It was faint at first, barely audible. It sounded like soft footsteps coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I froze, wondering if it was the house creaking again. But the footsteps kept coming. Slow, and deliberate, until they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, too afraid to move, but the silence that followed felt even worse. I was too scared to open the door, too scared to call out. After a few long minutes, the footsteps retreated, and the house returned to its eerie quiet. I didn't sleep much that night. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the house settling, but the fear lingered. The next day, I told myself I'd just been overthinking things. The house was old, after all. The sounds were probably from the foundation shifting or pipes rattling. Still, something about the whole situation gnawed at me. A few nights later, the footsteps returned. This time, I couldn't pretend it was just my imagination. I heard them distinctly, soft, slow, and too real to be ignored. The same slow steps moving toward my door. I was paralyzed with fear, but I gathered the courage to open the door, half expecting to find nothing there. But to my shock, the hallway was empty. I stood in the doorway for a moment, my heart pounding. The house was dark and still, just as it always was. The silence was almost suffocating. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked to the end of the hall, where the old wooden staircase creaked in protest as I ascended. There was nothing, no sign of anyone, no evidence of the footsteps I'd heard. I returned to my room, my mind racing. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived, or maybe it was the stress of the move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, almost like it was pressing in on me. The next night, I decided to leave a nightlight on. Maybe the darkness was messing with my mind. I settled into bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were accompanied by a soft, dragging sound, like something or someone was scraping along the floor. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The footsteps came closer, slowly, deliberately, until they stopped at my door again. My blood ran cold as I heard the soft sound of someone breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. And then the door handle rattled. Just once, but enough to send me into a panic. I rushed out of bed and bolted the door, my pulse racing. I sat there in the dark, too terrified to move. It was impossible to explain. There was no one there, no one who could have been making those sounds. My mind was in overdrive, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, barely sleeping. The house seemed to breathe with me. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside, amplified in my fear. The next morning, I decided to get to the bottom of it. Maybe I was just hearing things. I went online and searched for any history of the house, any stories that might explain the strange occurrences. To my surprise, there was something. The house had a history, but it wasn't the charming kind. Several owners had lived there over the years, but one family stood out. In the 1920s, a couple had moved in with their young daughter. The wife had died under mysterious circumstances, and the daughter was never seen again. Some said the daughter had vanished without a trace. Others whispered that she had been locked in the attic, left to die alone. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a tragic story, one that seemed to haunt the house even decades later. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But the next night, the footsteps returned, along with the soft, dragging sound. This time, I couldn't stay silent. I stood at the top of the stairs, my breath coming in short gasps, and called out into the darkness. "Is anyone there?" The house was silent for a moment, but then, to my horror, I heard a voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The voice came again, pleading, "Please, help me." I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. It couldn't be real, I told myself. There had to be an explanation, but deep down I knew I was hearing something that wasn't possible, something I couldn't explain away. The voice grew fainter, like it was fading into the walls themselves. The rest of the night passed in silence. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The house felt wrong, like it was no longer just a building, but a place where someone was trapped. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the memories of the past lingering like a shadow. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. But as I stepped out the door and into the daylight, I felt the weight of the house lifting off me. I never looked back. The house still stands, waiting for its next tenant. But I will never forget the footsteps, the voice, and the feeling that something had been left behind, lost in time, waiting for someone to hear its call. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When Sarah decided to rent the old Victorian house at the edge of town, she had no idea that it would change her life. She was a young professional, eager to escape the city for a quieter place to focus on her career and enjoy some solitude. The house was charming, with high ceilings, antique furniture, and a sprawling garden, and the rent was far more affordable than she had expected for such a beautiful property. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Hale, had warned her about a few quirks of the house, but nothing that stood out as concerning. He mentioned that the house had been in his family for generations and that it had a certain character, a charming way of saying it was old and creaky. He also mentioned that the house had been vacant for a few years as his family had moved to the city and that he was renting it out in an effort to maintain it. Sarah didn't mind. The quiet, peaceful environment suited her. Her first night in the house felt surreal. The air was cool, and the large windows allowed the moonlight to spill into her room. She unpacked her things, made herself some tea, and sat by the window, gazing out at the darkened landscape. The house creaked and groaned as it settled, but it felt comforting, like the house had a life of its own, gently adjusting to her presence. The first few days were peaceful. Sarah got used to the creaks and groans, attributing them to the house's age. There were, however, a few odd occurrences. Sometimes she would leave a room and return to find the furniture slightly rearranged. Once, she found a kitchen chair turned in a direction that she was certain hadn't been there before. She chalked it up to her being distracted and tired from unpacking and adjusting to the new place. After all, she was alone for the first time in years, and maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But then, the noises began. It started with whispers, faint but distinct, echoing from somewhere deep in the house. Sarah thought she was imagining it at first. She was alone. There was no one else in the house. But it wasn't just the whispers. Sometimes she would hear what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking through the hallway when she was certain no one was there. The footsteps would stop at her door, and then there would be silence. One evening, after a long day at work, Sarah was sitting in the living room reading a book when she heard a door slam somewhere in the house. It was so sudden and loud that it startled her, making her jump in her seat. She dropped her book and stood up, looking toward the hallway. Her heart pounded as she wondered if someone had gotten into the house. She cautiously walked to the door of the room she'd heard the slam come from, but when she opened it, she found nothing out of place. She called Mr. Hale the next day, hoping to get some answers. "Oh, the house does that sometimes," he said with a chuckle. "Old wood and such. Sometimes the wind catches the doors, makes them slam. Don't you worry about it." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the unease in her chest only grew. The house had a way of making her feel watched. Even when she was alone, she felt a presence, something just outside her peripheral vision, something that never quite let her feel at ease. Then came the night of the dream. Sarah had been sleeping soundly when she was suddenly awakened by a soft voice calling her name. Sarah. It was a whisper, but it was clear as if it was right next to her ear. She opened her eyes, her heart racing, but the room was empty. She listened intently, but there was only silence. The wind outside rustled the trees, but that was all. She shook her head and tried to sleep again, but the dream had already begun. In the dream, she was walking through the house, exploring the rooms one by one. The house was the same as it was in real life, but in the dream, it felt much larger, more maze-like. She moved from room to room, each one filled with strange shadows and odd sounds, but she couldn't escape. Every time she tried to leave the house, a door would lead her back to the same hallway, over and over again. The dream was vivid, so real, and in it she saw a figure, a woman, standing in the doorway of one of the rooms. The woman had long, dark hair and was dressed in an old-fashioned gown. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed Sarah as she walked past her. The woman's presence was so intense that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, Sarah was awake again, sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat. She was breathing heavily, her mind still reeling from the dream. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see the woman standing at the foot of her bed, but there was nothing. The room was quiet and still, but the unease never quite left her. The days that followed grew stranger. The whispers became more frequent, more distinct, until Sarah could no longer ignore them. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, like faint murmurs in the distance. Sometimes she would hear the sound of a door creaking open, even though she was certain she had closed them all. The footsteps, too, grew more insistent. They were no longer just occasional sounds. They were patterns, like someone was pacing back and forth outside her door. One evening, Sarah was sitting in the living room, trying to work, when she heard a distinct knock at the door. She jumped, her heart skipping a beat. Who could be visiting at this hour? She opened the door to find no one there, but on the doorstep was an old wooden box. It was small, intricately carved, and looked like it had been there for years. Hesitantly, Sarah picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cool wood. She brought it inside and placed it on the table, staring at it for a long moment. Something about it seemed familiar, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She opened the box slowly, her hands shaking. Inside there was nothing but an old photograph, a black and white picture of a woman standing in front of the very house she now lived in. The woman in the photograph looked remarkably similar to the one from her dream. Sarah felt a chill run through her. The box, the photograph, the woman. It was all too much. She needed to know more. She decided to visit Mr. Hale the next morning to ask about the house's history. When she arrived at his house, he welcomed her in with a warm smile, but as soon as she mentioned the strange occurrences, his expression faltered. I should have warned you, he said quietly. There's something you should know. He told her that many years ago, his great-aunt, the last woman to live in the house, had disappeared. She had been living there alone, and one day she simply vanished. No one knew what happened to her. Some believed she had gone mad, others thought she had run away, but no one could say for certain. The house had stood empty ever since, and the family never spoke much about it. As Sarah left Mr. Hale's house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still holding on to something, or someone. The whispers, the footsteps, the woman in the photograph, they were all tied to that history, to the house's dark past. That night, Sarah locked every door, checked every window, and sat in the living room, waiting for whatever was next. She knew that whatever presence had been haunting the house wasn't going to let her go that easily. But she also knew one thing for certain. She would never feel truly alone again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I moved into an old apartment in the city, a place I thought would be perfect for my first solo living experience. The building was one of those towering structures that had been around for decades, tucked between newer developments and shopping centers. It was affordable, with high ceilings, large windows, and a quiet charm about it. The landlord, an elderly woman, was kind but kept to herself, offering only the essentials as she handed me the keys. The first week in the apartment went by without incident. It was peaceful, too peaceful, I thought. The building, though old, had been renovated and seemed well kept. There were a few creaks here and there, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, on the second week, things started to feel off. It began with the noises. Late at night, I would hear faint scratching sounds from behind the walls. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the building settling. After all, it was an old structure, and such sounds were common. But as the nights went on, the noises became more frequent, more distinct. The sound of something or someone scratching at the wall would echo through the silence of my apartment. It wasn't random either. It was rhythmic, like something was trying to get through the wall. I dismissed it at first, assuming it was rats or some sort of animal in the walls. But then came the tapping. It started one evening when I was sitting on the couch reading a book. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound began, originating from the wall next to my sofa. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle but insistent. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the sound continued, I couldn't help but feel unnerved. I got up and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I knocked back, hoping it was just the building shifting. There was no response, no sound from the other side of the wall. I told myself it was nothing, just the apartment's age, the shifting of old timber. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping continued, coming in short, staccato bursts, as if someone, was knocking on the wall. Tap, 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 and then the scratching started again, this time from the ceiling above me. I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I spoke to the landlord about the noises. She listened quietly, nodding. "It's probably just the pipes," she said, "or maybe some old rats in the walls." She reassured me that the building was structurally sound and nothing to worry about. But something in her eyes told me she knew more than she was letting on. I dismissed it, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. That night, I decided to stay up late, hoping the noises would stop if I was awake. I sat in the living room, watching the clock tick toward midnight. The apartment was still and quiet, too quiet. The silence seemed unnatural, as if the whole place was holding its breath. And then, at exactly midnight, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't just the tapping. I froze when I heard a voice. A soft, low whisper, as if someone was standing just behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone, desperate, pleading, was unmistakable. It sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The only response was more tapping. Tap, tap, tap. But the whispering grew louder, closer, as if the voice was moving toward me. I stood up, my legs shaky, and turned in a circle, looking for the source of the sound. There was nothing. No one. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. It felt like a gust of cold wind swept through the apartment, and I shivered involuntarily. The whispering stopped, replaced by a soft thud, like something had fallen onto the floor. I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my things and ran out of the apartment, heart racing. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had been in the apartment long before I arrived. I spent the night in a nearby cafe trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next day, I went to the landlord's office again. She was there, waiting for me, as if she had expected me to return. I told her everything, the tapping, the whispering, the cold air. She sighed and looked away for a moment as though she was considering whether or not to tell me something. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't want to say anything," she began, her voice quiet, "but that apartment, it's been empty for a long time for a reason." She went on to tell me that years ago, a man had lived in the apartment, a man who had been reclusive and strange. He had lived there for years, never really interacting with anyone. One night, the police were called to the building when neighbors reported strange noises coming from his apartment. When they arrived, they found him dead, his body cold, his eyes wide open in terror. The police never found a cause of death. Some said he had been driven mad by the spirits in the building. Others claimed he had seen something in the walls. I felt my stomach churn as I listened. It seemed impossible, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The tapping, the whispering, it all made sense now. The apartment was haunted, and whatever presence lingered there wasn't finished with me. I asked the landlord if anyone else had experienced anything strange in the building, but she just shook her head. "It's not something I want to talk about," she said. "I'm sorry. I should have told you before, but I didn't think it would affect you." I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, stuck in a place I couldn't escape. The landlord offered to let me move into another apartment in the building, but I refused. I didn't want to stay in a place that had been cursed by whatever had tormented that poor man. I packed up my things that day, left the keys on the counter, and never looked back. As I walked out of the building, I swear I could hear the faintest tapping from the walls as if something was trying to call me back. I moved to another apartment on the other side of town, but even now, every time I walk past that old building, I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know who or what is still there, but I know one thing for sure. I will never set foot in that place again. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I moved into the old house on Maple Street in the fall of 2018. It was an estate sale, the kind where everything is sold off at once, and no one really asks about the history of the place. The house was large, creaky, and had a strange charm to it. A little too much dust on the shelves and the paint peeling in the corners, but overall, I thought it would make a good project. I had recently come into a little money and thought it would be the perfect place to start fresh. I could hear the whispers of the neighbors, who all seemed to know something about the house, but they never said anything outright. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time cleaning and rearranging furniture. The house was large, with high ceilings and a winding staircase that creaked with each step I took. There was a large attic I hadn't yet ventured into, and a basement that smelled like mildew. But those first few weeks, I didn't think much about it. I was too busy unpacking and organizing to worry about any ghost stories or rumors the neighbors whispered. It was about a month into living there when I started hearing the sounds. At first, they were subtle. A door creaking open when I knew I hadn't opened it. Footsteps in the hallway when I was alone in the house. Little things, but I dismissed them. Old houses make noise, I told myself. I convinced myself that the wind or the house settling was the cause. I didn't want to believe that there was something more. But as time went on, the sounds grew louder. At night, I would hear what sounded like someone walking up the stairs. The footfalls were slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to be quiet, but it was impossible to ignore. The first time it happened, I jumped out of bed, thinking someone had broken in. But when I went to check, there was no one there. The house was dark, quiet, and still. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, convinced I'd forgotten to secure something. But everything was locked tight, and I was alone. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the old house doing its thing, but I couldn't help the growing sense of unease that followed me through the halls. One evening, a few weeks later, I was sitting on the couch reading when I heard the door creak open again, followed by the sound of footsteps. This time, they were coming down the hallway toward the living room. My heart raced, and I stood up, my hands trembling. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. No answer. Just silence. I walked toward the hallway, but when I reached it, there was no one in sight. I called the police that night, just to be sure. They came by, checked the windows, the doors, but found nothing. The officer, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, reassured me. "Old houses do that sometimes. Sounds carry, and the wood in these houses can make strange noises when the weather changes. You'll get used to it." He left with a friendly pat on the shoulder, but I wasn't so sure. I didn't want to believe it, but after that night, I began to feel a presence. It was subtle at first, like someone was watching me from the shadows. I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then, one night, I heard a voice. It was a soft whisper, but clear as day. "Get out." I froze, my blood running cold. I looked around the room, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one. I was alone. I rushed to the window, checking to see if anyone was outside, but there was no one. The neighborhood was quiet, just the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. I told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired and the old house was playing tricks on me. But it wasn't just the noises anymore. Every time I walked down the hallway, I could feel eyes on me, like someone was right behind me. I would glance over my shoulder, but no one was there. And then came the night. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had been working late, typing away at my computer in the study, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, coming up the stairs. I didn't even turn around this time. I knew what it was. I heard the sound of the door to the study creak open, and then the footsteps stopped just outside the door. My heart was pounding my chest. I didn't dare look up. The door opened slowly, inch by inch, until it was wide enough for someone to step through. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric and then nothing. No more footsteps. No sound at all. I sat there, frozen in place, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I finally turned around, but no one was there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up in the study, listening to the house creak and groan, the footsteps slowly fading away. I knew I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Something was there. Something that didn't want me to be there. The next morning, I called a paranormal investigator. I hadn't wanted to believe in ghosts, but at that point, I was desperate for answers. The investigator, a tall man named Paul, arrived later that afternoon with his equipment, an EMF detector, cameras, and audio recorders. He was professional, serious, and didn't seem fazed by the history of the house. "We'll get to the bottom of it," he said confidently. "Let's see what's really going on." We spent hours walking through the house, setting up equipment in each room. Paul took readings in the basement, the attic, and the living room. When he reached the second floor, he asked me to sit with him in the hallway while he conducted a session with a spirit box, a device that supposedly allows spirits to communicate. As the static crackled and popped, I could feel the air grow colder. The temperature dropped noticeably. Paul's eyes widened as he listened to the faint whispers that began to emerge from the static. "Get out," a voice said, clearly and loudly. My heart stopped. It was the same voice I had heard that night. "Who are you?" Paul asked the spirit. The response was a mere whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Leave. Now." Paul looked at me, his expression grim. "This place is haunted, but it's not just the house. There's something darker here, something old. I think it's tied to the land." I didn't want to hear it, but it explained everything. The noises, the feeling of being watched, the voice that had whispered at me. I didn't stay much longer after that. I moved out within a week, unable to shake the feeling that the house and whatever was inside it wanted me gone. The house on Maple Street is still there, and the rumors about its haunting have only grown over the years. They say it's cursed, that the spirits of those who once lived there never truly left. I never went back. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, dismissing them as nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. But that was before I moved into the old townhouse on Maple Street. It wasn't the nicest place, dusty, a bit run down, and with a strange smell in the corners of the rooms, but it was affordable, and I was eager to start fresh. After all, a fresh start is what I needed. The first few days were quiet, uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up furniture, and explored the small garden outside. It felt peaceful, like the weight of my past was slowly lifting. The townhouse was old, over 100 years, the landlord said, but it had character. There was a creaky charm to it, the kind of place that made you feel like something important had happened here once. It was during the third week that I started hearing things. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the way old homes do. Little creaks, whispers of the floorboards moving beneath my feet. But then it started happening more often. I'd be in the kitchen making dinner, and I'd hear what sounded like someone walking around upstairs. Slow footsteps, dragging slightly as if the person didn't want to be heard. I'd pause, wait, listen. But when I went upstairs, there was no one there. The first time it really unnerved me was when I woke up in the middle of the night, a strange sense of unease settling over me. The air in the room felt thick, and there was a coldness that hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. I looked at the clock. It was 2:13 a.m. I heard it then. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. It wasn't the house settling. It was someone walking. Someone alive and awake. But there was no one in the house but me. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. It grew louder, closer, until it sounded like whoever was walking was just outside my door, right next to me. I wanted to call out, to demand to know who was there, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest. After a long while, the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and in the morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. The house was old, and old houses make noises, I told myself. It was nothing. The next few nights, however, the footsteps returned, always at the same time, always when I was lying in bed trying to sleep. The slow, dragging steps, the soft shuffle of something or someone moving around in the darkness. I started to dread going to bed at night. I found myself staying up late, hoping I would fall asleep before the footsteps started. But it was always the same. No matter how late it got, they would come. And when they did, it was like the house itself was watching me, waiting for something. I didn't tell anyone about what was happening. It felt ridiculous. How could I explain to people that I was hearing things that didn't make sense? That I was hearing footsteps in an empty house? So I kept it to myself. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I thought maybe I was just stressed, that my imagination was running wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I decided to confront it. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I couldn't keep living in fear. As soon as I heard the footsteps again, I got out of bed and walked into the hallway, my heart racing. I stood in the dark, listening, waiting. The footsteps came closer, just as they always did. I turned the corner toward the stairs leading to the second floor and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. A tall, dark figure, standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the faint light from the window at the far end of the hall. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was like it was staring at me, though I couldn't see its face. The air in the hallway felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. My body froze. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. After what felt like an eternity, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows. It didn't vanish entirely, but it retreated, like it was pulling back into the darkness, disappearing into the walls themselves. I stood there, in shock, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The footsteps stopped. The house was silent again. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to think, but I knew one thing. I was no longer alone in that house. The next day, I asked the landlord if she knew anything about the history of the townhouse. She seemed hesitant at first, as though she was deciding whether or not to tell me something. Finally, she spoke. "There was an old couple who lived here many years ago," she said softly. "They were quiet, reclusive. The woman was different. Some people said she had a way of speaking to things. Not people, but things. The house, I mean, she used to say that it was full of voices, of memories." She paused, looking at me closely. "They both passed away a few years ago. The house was empty for a long time before you moved in." I didn't know what to make of her words. I wasn't sure if she was trying to explain away the things I had been hearing, or if she was hinting at something darker. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was haunting the house wasn't finished yet. It was the following night that I heard the whispering. It started as a low murmur, barely audible, but it grew louder. It was coming from the walls, from the very floor beneath me. The same slow, deliberate rhythm I had heard in the footsteps, but now it was something more. A voice, faint and distant, but filled with a quiet desperation. "Help, please." I didn't know if it was a plea for help or a warning, but I couldn't stay in that house anymore. That night, I packed my things and left. I couldn't explain it. I didn't have any answers. But as I walked out the door, I felt a sense of relief, like I was finally free of whatever had been holding me there. I never went back to that townhouse on Maple Street. The landlord called me several times, asking if I was okay, but I never answered. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had happened or what I had seen. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. There was something in that house, something that was waiting for me, and I wasn't willing to find out what it was. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I've always been a skeptic, the kind of person who chalks up strange occurrences to coincidence or the imagination. But that all changed the night I moved into the old house on Pine Street. I had recently gone through a breakup and decided to start fresh in a new town. A small, quiet place. When I found a rental listing for an old Victorian house, I thought it was perfect. The rent was cheap, the house was spacious, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful. The landlady, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Winters, gave me a warm smile and a handshake when I signed the lease. I didn't think much about the house's age or its location, tucked away on a quiet street far from the center of town. The first night I spent there was uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up the furniture, and spent the evening drinking tea in front of the fireplace. The house felt drafty but cozy, and I settled into the rhythm of the place. There were a few oddities. The floorboards creaked in strange places, and the walls seemed to moan as if the house was sighing. But I didn't think much of it. After all, it was an old house. The second night, however, was different. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was the house settling, or maybe an animal outside, but the steps were too deliberate, too measured. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it reached the door of my bedroom. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then I heard a soft scraping sound, like fingers running along the wall. My pulse quickened, and I reached for my phone on the bedside table, but before I could unlock it, the scraping stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I gathered the courage to open the door. There was nothing there. No one in the hallway, no sign of anyone having been there. I checked all the rooms, half expecting to find someone hiding, but everything was exactly as I had left it. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was just overtired, or perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. But the unease lingered. Every little sound seemed amplified. The wind rattling the windows, the creaks of the floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The following night, I decided to leave the lights on, hoping that it would make me feel safer. But the footsteps returned, louder this time, and this time they didn't stop at my door. I heard them move down the hallway toward the staircase. I lay frozen in bed, my eyes wide in the darkness, too terrified to move. The sound of the steps grew faint as they ascended the stairs. As I listened, the air in the room grew cold, and I could see my breath in the dim light. A sense of dread washed over me, and I finally mustered the courage to get up and investigate. I crept through the house, checking each room again. The house was empty, silent, and still. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, just barely visible in the shadows. It was a tall, thin shape, draped in what looked like a long, tattered robe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. My breath caught in my throat, and I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. Slowly, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I rushed back to my room, locked the door, and tried to calm my racing heart. I couldn't explain what had just happened. Was it my imagination? A trick of the light? Or was there something in that house? Something I couldn't see clearly? The next day, I spoke to Mrs. Winters, hoping to get some answers. She seemed like a kind woman, and I thought maybe she could reassure me. When I mentioned the footsteps, she didn't look surprised. She told me that the house had a long history, and many tenants had reported strange occurrences over the years. People say the house is haunted, she said, almost casually. But it's nothing to be afraid of. Just old spirits, you know? They don't mean any harm. I was stunned. I had never believed in ghosts, but hearing Mrs. Winters speak so matter-of-factly about it sent a chill down my spine. She went on to tell me that the house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Thomas Caldwell. He was a reclusive man, known to be eccentric, and some said he dabbled in dark practices. Mrs. Winters didn't know all the details, but she mentioned that he had died unexpectedly, and soon after, strange things started happening in the house. I decided to look into the history myself. I went to the local library and dug through old newspapers and records. What I found only deepened my unease. There had been reports of unexplained noises, strange figures seen in windows, and other odd occurrences that went back over a century. But the most chilling thing I discovered was the story of Thomas Caldwell's death. He had been found dead in his study, but the cause of death was never determined. His body showed no signs of trauma, and the room was locked from the inside. By now, I was no longer sleeping in the house. I would leave during the day and return only when I had to. But every night, without fail, the footsteps would return. Always at the same time, 2 a.m. I could hear them pacing down the hallway, stopping outside my door, moving up the stairs. Sometimes I would hear faint whispers, voices just beyond the edge of hearing. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I stayed awake, watching the hallway from the safety of my bedroom. As the clock struck 2 a.m., the footsteps began again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I jumped out of bed and walked into the hallway, determined to find the source. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I saw the figure again. It was standing in the same spot as before, in the shadows at the end of the hallway. This time, however, I wasn't paralyzed with fear. I called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but as I stood there staring, something strange happened. The air grew colder and I could see my breath again. The figure took a slow step forward, its long, tattered robe dragging on the floor. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and then, in a voice like a distant whisper, it spoke. "Leave, or it will never stop." I didn't need to hear more. I turned on my heel and ran downstairs, out of the house, and didn't look back. I moved out the next day. I found another place, an apartment in town, and never set foot in that house again. I don't know what was in that house on Pine Street, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. I still hear the footsteps sometimes when I try to sleep, but they're always distant, fading away as if they were never really there. Story, the end.